Well, I joined the British Navy in 1963 and really hung up my sea boots in 1996, which was about 6 years after the Cold War ended. I joined submarines in 1967 and really served either at sea or in submarine type roles till 1996.
What did the Cold War look like from the perspective of the Royal Navy, from the perspective of submarine service within the Royal Navy?
Yeah.
And then I guess a more particular question would be within that, as you look back now, can you, do you see kind of a difference in what the Cold War looks like from that perspective, say in the 60s? And then maybe a later time. And then as you get into the late 80s, did did the Cold War seem like a different thing, if the question makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, certainly in terms of the Royal Navy, or the Royal Navy assumed continuous at sea deterrence from 1969, taking over from the Royal Air Force. And since then, we have maintained one, or at least one, uh, SSBN at sea on continuous quick reaction alert, QRA. And that really has been a large focus of the Royal Navy since then. And in fact, increasing as maintaining the deterrent becomes increasingly expensive. It's buying up a bigger chunk of our annual defense budget. So that that was our focus, and in many ways, as we built up our nuclear attack submarine force and a diesel submarine force, that was to the detriment of our surface navy. Uh, we lost our big fixed-wing aircraft carriers in the mid 1970s. These were replaced by three small carriers, which are jump jets, but were not nearly as potent, as effective as the large strike carriers. So, and there's no two ways about it, all this effort and the best of our talent going into the submarine service deprived the surface navy of ships capable of defending themselves against air attack. And of course, that became very relevant during the Falklands War in 1982. Now, in terms of the, the submarine services perspective of the Cold War, there was, as I mentioned, continuous at sea deterrence and supporting the SSBN on patrol to make sure it wasn't counter-detected. And therefore, we very much relied upon American sources information. And we had an SSN on quick reaction alert to go out if Soviet submarine was detected in areas where our SSBN might be. There was, as the number of Soviet nuclear submarines increased going to the Mediterranean in the 1970s and 80s and going off the US eastern seaboard for the missile patrols, then we in the Royal Navy, it became a priority to track these Soviet submarines, find out what they were up to, where they were going, what they were doing. Another key role of the submarine service was intelligence gathering, and we very much, from the 1950s, partook in the joint US-UK program up in the Barents Sea, collecting information on Russian surface ships and submarines, observing and recording the missile firings, the torpedo firings. We also extended that to the Baltic and to the Mediterranean. The Baltic, in particular, of course, shallow water, not ideally suited for a nuclear submarine. So our once or twice a year, we'd send a diesel submarine to the Baltic, purely an intelligence gathering mission. In the Mediterranean, our submarines were particularly focused upon gathering information on the Russian surface fleet, which was anchored off Libya. That involved, on occasions, doing underwater looks or hull surveys of these ships to see what sonar they had or what underwater weapons. Um, the submarine service, of course, was very much involved in training our surface ship assets in anti-submarine warfare, and very much involved also in uh, in evaluating new equipment, which was coming into service. So that, in a bit of a nutshell, is what the main priorities and focus of the submarine service was during the early Cold War era, and it didn't really change that much into the 1980s. Soviet activity became more intense and more challenging. Um, the Soviet submarines, the original or the original nuclear submarines, were pretty noisy and easy to track and trail. But during the 80s, the latest classes, the Victor 3s and the Akulas, became a lot quieter and much more difficult to track. So that was quite a difference. Now, post 1990, or 89, when the Berlin Wall came down, the Soviet submarine service and the stuff just practically shut down. They just stayed in harbor. And so the level of activity, apart from their SSBNs, fell away very, very sharply.
So you mentioned that it becomes more intense and more challenging in the 80s as Soviet technology improves.
Yeah.
Was that intensity and that sense of challenge, was it primarily about, a technological competition, almost maybe think of it as a professional competition? Um, was there really a concern as we look back that the Soviet Union and the US, Britain, allied countries would actually go to war? And the reason I ask this question is, now this is the perspective of a junior non-commissioned sailor in the US Navy who knew almost nothing. But
Mm,
in the late 80s, on aboard the carrier, we had a Soviet ship, a fishing boat, supposedly, that
mm,
looked nothing like a fishing boat, that trailed us for a few days. And so, why would a Soviet fishing boat trail an aircraft carrier for a few days? It was obviously an intelligence boat. But we would go back to the stern of the ship and wave at them, and they would wave back. And then one time, we had what was called a steel beach picnic, where the aircraft carrier is anchored. We bring plastic pools up on the flight deck. A band comes out and plays. Basically, we have a day off on the flight deck. And a huge Soviet spy plane just came flying right over the ship at very low altitude. And as I remember that, no one was really concerned. No one was worried. We sort of thought that was kind of a cool thing, and the sailors on the aircraft carrier made various gestures toward the plane, and I was always thought, what those photographs looked like when, as they're taking photos going over this carrier and the various gestures that the American sailors are making. But I look back on it, and at least in the late 80s, the Soviet Union, we knew it was there, but there was no feeling of threat. It seemed like when discussions of like something serious came up, it had to do with Iran. And so I'm wondering, I mean, does that, what I'm describing, there is this competition, but did it feel, and is there a change? I mean, did it feel one way in the 60s and a different way in the 80s? Did it feel that when you refer to this intensity, this sense of challenge, as you look back on that, was it primarily a professional challenge, technological challenge, or was there always this grinding concern that we may actually end up going to war with
Well,
the Soviet
I
Union?
mean, yes, I mean, there was certainly there was I should say, you put it as a technical challenge and a technical race. There was no two ways about it. And as I mentioned earlier, the Soviets were getting better at the design of the submarines. Um, there was always in the back of our minds that fear that things could go hot, either by intention or by mistake. So, in terms of our readiness to fight, yes, we were I think it was, it was a high priority to make sure our weapon systems were correct, they would work. And indeed, at my time in American submarines, got to see with them, that was the early 80s. Yeah, there was this feeling of the buck stops here. You know, we're there to prevent uh, and deter the Soviets from trying anything smart at sea.
So I think we might be touching here on, obviously the difference between the responsibilities of an officer and, and then eventually as a senior officer and a low-ranking non-commissioned sailor whose
Mm.
responsibilities are pretty minimal. Um, so let's jump ahead. When you get to the place where you are in command of a submarine, um, and you use the phrase the loneliness of command. So I
Mm.
imagine part of that, I'm thinking, whatever the responsibilities are, I have no idea what they would be. So I'm interested in hearing you talk about that. But the responsibilities are, of course, the management and the functioning of the submarine, but also concerns about, ensuring that this submarine doesn't do anything that might send the wrong message to the Soviets, which then could lead to some chain of
Yeah,
events.
yeah, yeah. Oh yes, I mean, I did when I was driving a diesel submarine an underwater look on a Soviet tug, which was anchored off the west of the Shetland Islands and off of Scotland, and uh, it was difficult to do when it was at anchor um, because there was concern that it might well have a capability of sending divers out through the bottom of the hull, and these divers going ashore onto Shetland with maybe sabotage in mind or whatever. Um, and I say it was very difficult to do at anchor because it was it was a very small vessel and there was a strong tide running. I eventually achieved it when she went to sea. I got good photographs under the hull, and apart from the usual sort of logs and stuff like that, there was nothing unusual. But it occurred to me afterwards, and I don't think it had been really thought through, because I mean, it was under instructions to do this underwater hull survey. If I'd got caught up in an anchor, I could have pulled the ship under
Hmm.
quite easily and drowned a lot of the guys on board the ship. So, sometimes it could be very high stakes, very high stakes.
Let's go back. What was it that attracted you to the submarine service in the first place?
Well, my family for many generations went to sea. There were Scottish fishermen, fished on the west coast of Scotland. And I felt it natural. I'd go to sea when I finished my school education. And the best prospects, undoubtedly, was the Royal Navy rather than the Merchant Navy or the fishing fleets, which were both beginning to see a bit of a decline. And having joined the Royal Navy, it was quite clear at the time the submarine service was the place to be because it was expanding rapidly. We were getting nuclear submarines. As I mentioned, we were becoming responsible for the nuclear deterrent. And you got responsibility at a very young age. I mean, I was ex of diesel boat at the age of 24 and command at the age of 29. That was exciting times, and I must say that the command of the diesel boat, it was only for 18 months, but it set me in very good shape when I went on to command nuclear submarines. I had done a sort of command apprenticeship. Nowadays, uh, our Navy hasn't got diesel submarines, and so there's not that luxury of people training in diesel boats before and cutting their teeth in diesel boats before actually going out to nuclear submarines.
You write that it takes a unique type of person to serve in submarines. Um, and the topic just came up a couple days ago. I was talking to a veteran of a small U.S. military action in the island of Grenada, and somehow
Mm,
submarines came up.
mm,
And he said what, you often hear, at least what I often hear when discussion of subs comes up, and that is, I don't know how those guys do it. I would go insane living on a submarine. But there are some folks who do it well and who succeed at it. Um,
mm.
what, in your experience, are the characteristics of someone who is successful at submarine service?
Well, I think undoubtedly you've got to have a calm disposition and a positive disposition as well, and a sense of humor helps. There's no two ways about that. Um, you've got to have good interpersonal skills to get the best out of the crew. Um, you've got to be able to grasp technical detail quickly and keep yourself up to date uh, with changing equipment and changing requirements for your skill sets. Um, I, I mean, I've never suffered claustrophobia. I haven't come across anybody serving submarines who had claustrophobia. I think when I joined submarines, and not till recently, you had to go through the escape tower, um, and escaping from a chamber 100 foot down. And I think if you suffer from claustrophobia, it would have been bored out by then. No, I think the other thing is the big positive thing. You mentioned yourselves, an aircraft carrier crew of maybe 4 or 5,000. A submarine, you're talking 100, 120 people. There's a real community spirit there, and there's inevitably great characters, and there's some rogues as well. Um, but I mean, looking back, I'd both junior ratings, senior ratings, and officers. I served with a tremendous bunch of people. I mean, they really were quality people, very loyal, very hardworking, and very often very ingenious. So, I mean, it was a real privilege to serve with that type of person. In the War College in Newport, we did one of these Myers-Briggs tests. You know, Myers-Briggs did a set what type of character you have. And curiously, when they got all the data, there was maybe 300 students there. The submariners, and we're all submarine commanding officer types, you know, we commanders, tend to lean on the introvert side and the
Really?
deep thinking side rather than extrovert side. I certainly would be more introvert. So if something goes wrong, rather than gather the officers together and try and thrash it out together, I would sit in my stateroom or cabin, mulling over what did I do wrong. Um, you know, next time round, I'll do better or fix this or fix that, as opposed to the chap going into the wardroom with the God bloody hell, we get away with that one, ha ha ha. No, that was my character, and therefore I I didn't share so big problems which were arising easily with the other officers. I tended to keep them to myself, not all the time, but
That's interesting. So if the successful submariner tends to be on the introverted side, then we're talking about this context where there's not a whole lot of space, but where the folks on the submarine, though, they do respect what space there is.
yes.
Does that make sense? And so there's
Yeah,
a
yeah, 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 yeah,
yeah.
exactly. As you said, they do respect space, what space there is. And if someone's going through a bit of a bad time, they'll give him his own space, so to speak. Yeah,
And then just I've picked up from you, you refer to the um, you say the best of our talent early on, the best of our
yeah,
talent was attracted
yeah,
submarines. The
yeah,
other
yeah.
thing you mentioned. Um, do you think that submarine service, and maybe I'm thinking particularly of the nuclear propelled subs, but does submarine service require um, not only people of a certain disposition or range within human personalities, but does it also require a higher than average level of intelligence? I mean, does a submarine crew need to be not only folks who can basically get along with others,
Yeah, yes,
but
yeah, yeah, yeah.
also we're talking about intelligent people, highly.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I would say that. it's a bit of a broad statement, but I think sadly there's an element of truth in that. I mean, I go back to my time in Swiftsure, which was brand new, a new class submarine. Well, four of the officers had been to Oxford or Cambridge, our top universities, and were, very bright individuals. Curiously, one ended up leaving the Navy and going to MI6 and was very successful in MI6. Another chap went on to be CEO of a fairly big tech company. So I was blessed with a lot of very smart people around me, very smart people.
Was there a difference in the culture aboard a diesel sub and a nuclear sub? Did you notice any
Oh
difference?
yes, well, I mean the diesel submarine, I suppose it's like driving an electric car. All the time, you were aware of the battery and your endurance. I mean, that was 24/7. Whatever you were doing. And that would apply today even with air-independent propulsion. It's not unlimited. So there was that aspect. The next thing was that you spend a lot more time on the surface because you can go a lot faster on the surface than dive, and therefore you probably, certainly in northern climes, have to endure bad weather and in cold, damp conditions often. And of course, the submarine rolling around, if you're prone to seasickness, it was not good. Whereas a nuclear submarine, you dived, stable platform most of the time, but it could be rough at periscope depth, roll a bit. So it was a much more benign environment. The temperature was kept at 67 degrees Fahrenheit. The air purity was always in specification. Yeah, a very different, say, culture and ambience. And of course, it was rather like going from a small family saloon car, which could do 70 miles an hour, to a Ferrari. You had tremendous capability and maneuverability in the nuclear submarine, which you simply didn't have in the diesel submarine. So quite a difference, and technically very much more challenging than diesel submarine.
And therefore, a crew that is much more highly trained, or at least highly trained in certain technical fields, highly technical
Yeah,
fields.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
And you spent some time in the U.S.
yeah,
Among U.S. naval submarine
yeah, yeah,
vehicles.
yeah.
Were there any significant differences that you
Well,
noticed?
there were. I mean, I think one of the big differences was that all the line officers, not the specialist officers, but the line officers, had to qualify on the nuclear propulsion plant, which in the Royal Navy we don't. So they were very knowledgeable of operating the nuclear plant. That was one major difference. Uh, they they were a bit more rule bound than we were. And I'm now talking some time ago, it might well have changed already, but certainly they tended to be more rule bound. I'm subject to much more bureaucratic interference than we were. I'll give you an example that I was sitting in the wardroom of one submarine, I forget which one it was, and I saw a piece of paper, and on this piece of paper were all the inspections, annual inspections this submarine had to go through. And there was about 50 of them, believe it or not, 50. So if you're on harbour, it would work out one a week. You've got a bit at sea, it would be probably two a week when you're time in harbour. And right down the bottom of this list was a dental records inspection. Why dental records? Well, you might recall the terrible business in Beirut, where a large number of Marines were killed by a blast. And they couldn't figure out afterwards from the dental records, which bodies were which. So the US Navy took a rather large sledgehammer to crack a small nut in imposing dental inspections on every single ship or submarine. dental record inspections, which certainly in the case of the Royal Navy, right, your dental records were held ashore, and you never ever have to go through a dental records inspection. And if you look all the way up, right at the top, there were nuclear weapons inspection. That was fair dinkum, as indeed was the reactor inspection, operational availability, but down the bottom was an awful lot of dross. And that doesn't make good for retention officers because it means in harbour they spend a lot of time on this mundane paperwork, which is not good. Far more than in my time than the Royal Navy.
Do you think that this kind of intense record keeping all the way down to things obviously some things
Yeah,
you want to inspect regularly, but
yeah.
other things like you mentioned that the dental records, does that reflect, do you think, the culture created by Admiral Rickover, which just called for absolute precision in everything?
Yeah, I mean, Rickover undoubtedly had a big impact. I mean, obviously a huge impact upon the reactor and the general submarine systems. Whether he would have wanted to get down to the details of such, minutiae as dental records or medical records, etc., I'm not sure. Frankly, I'm not sure that. I mean, I think uh, Rickover had a very good assessment of American character, and he, you know, ran the nuclear propulsion program at sea with a rod of iron because knowing well that if you didn't run it with a rod of iron, someone's going to step out of line and have a real cock up, and the whole program could come to a grinding halt.
You
Uh,
had some interactions with Admiral Rickover.
yeah, I mean, we just one incident. I mean, I saw him. He came aboard a hire during the commissioning ceremony. I do remember he walked on board. The vice president was George Bush. He was the guest of honor. He strode up the gangplank wearing a raincoat and looked around and gave a very short speech. He said, "The submarine has only one role to perform, and that's put the fear of God into the Russian people."
You, uh, relate what Admiral Rickover said. The purpose of this submarine is to put the fear of God into the Soviet people. Um, and that raises in my mind, this theme of the Cold War, mutually assured destruction,
Russian, yeah,
um, which, it seems in retrospect to have made some sense if we have a situation where neither side can really win a conflict,
yeah, yeah,
we're not going to have a conflict. And so the submarine's primary job is just to be a continual reminder.
exactly, exactly, absolutely,
Don't start
absolutely.
a war with us because it's not
No,
winnable. All right.
no, it's not winnable.
One of the things I'm interested in is, on the sub, it's going 24 hours a day. And so you have these continual watches. Um, and I'm wondering how you dealt with this as an officer, the challenge on the one hand of operating a highly sophisticated machine under the ocean's surface, and also dealing with the, I think, inevitable fatigue that sets in when you have sailors who are doing standing
Mm,
watch around the
mm.
clock. What was the way of dealing with that? Or
Well, I think one good management, and when you can stand down people, stand them down. Don't have them standing watch for having standing watch's sake. I mean, if you could take an example, normally speaking, in the submarine control room, nuclear submarine, you'll have three officers um, in any sort of tactical situation, plus the captain. But if you're in passage, going deep and fast, you can reduce to one officer. One officer can cope himself. So the other two can stand down. They can watch a movie, read a book, or just relax. I think it's all about managing people and making sure that someone is not overstretched. I mean, I'm not trying to criticize your Navy, but one of my friends was an American submarine, and it was off. New England, the winter time, and somehow they managed to screw up the chap who was up on the bridge. They left him up there too long. And he was taken down with hypothermia off the bridge. Now, how the heck did that happen? Where was the management? Where was the guy supervising how long that chap was up top, or just checking he was all right? But been left, I think he was left up top for about 8 hours.
Yeah.
So I think it's just one little example, and that happens. That not as bad as that, but these things do happen through people not really thinking things through in terms of the people who work for them.
Mm. Yeah, so this gets back to the responsibility of the officer, right?
Yeah, 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 yeah,
The
yeah.
junior non-commissioned
Mm.
sailor has his or her little world to think about. The
Yeah,
officer
yeah,
has to think
yeah,
about the whole
yeah.
story.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, at times, I mean, especially when I mentioned that business of the task force, I was absolutely exhausted. I mean, I stood down. I'd share the command responsibility with the EXO, but I found that if you're pounding along behind a Russian submarine, only 4 or 5 miles behind it, day after day at speed, I wasn't sleeping well. And any change of the propeller or any report, instantly I was awake. There's always a bit of a worry, uh, you know, of any event which happens on board the submarine. In the back of your mind, because a nuclear submarine, a day before you went to sea, they started flashing up the reactor, whether that was going to work well, whether there was what defects. And I mean, typically, uh, before going to sea, uh, especially in Valiant, I get a phone call at 2 or 3 in the morning with maybe some problem and something leaking or whatever, and I had to make a decision. But that was all part of the deal, really. You never ever in harbour. You're never relaxed, never relaxed. Even on when you're on holiday, you might go overseas, but you're still in the back of mind. You're responsible for that submarine, no matter what happened to it. Might have nothing to do with you, but at the end of the day, you're ultimately responsible.
What are the benefits in your mind that offset then the challenges that come with being an officer? Um, Suppose, you're having a discussion with a junior officer who's interested in making a
Mm,
career of the service, and
mm, mm,
you have
mm.
this discussion, and this junior officer, hears you say this, that, the pressure is always on. And then the question is, well, then why should I stick with it? What are the attractions on the other side? What are the benefits on the other side?
I think one of the big challenges for the more senior officers on board submarines is how you mentor and encourage the junior officers, how you treat them, how you train them, how you give them responsibility. So at the end of the day, they will sign on again. I think it's imperative, you've got to encourage the more junior officers. This is a worthwhile career. You will have more responsibility. Obviously, you get paid more money. But at the end of the day, you've got a hell of a lot of job satisfaction, which, I mean, comparing it to the check back after the nuclear submarine, just opening up valves and working in the engine room, you at the end of the day, you can sit back and look back and think, well, I did a pretty good job. Um, I mean, I think that's in many ways that's what life is about, isn't it? A degree of satisfaction with a job well done.
Let me put you in front of a group, just in your mind's eye, in front of a group of 100 bright young people, British or American. Um, they have the intellectual ability to serve aboard a nuclear powered
Mm,
sub.
mm,
Um, so the question isn't smarts. And
mm,
let's say they've gone through, some sort of personality testing, and indications are that they would get along okay on sub. So we're talking about young people who are qualified for subservice,
mm,
but they're wondering, should I do university?
mm,
There are things I can do at the university that I can't do on a
mm,
submarine.
mm,
And so they're wondering, well, should I do this submarine service?
mm.
And so we're going to put you in front of that group for a few minutes, to share with them from your experience why they should give submarine service uh, consideration. What would you say?
Well, I think certainly they will get great job satisfaction. Okay, they will undoubtedly experience superb camaraderie in with the crews they go to sea on. They will get great responsibility bestowed upon them because one person in the submarine can cause a disaster if they get things wrong. And I think at the end of the day, when they finish their working life, they can look back and say, again, as I mentioned these words, that was a job I did well, and I'd served my country. I made a difference, and I made a difference to other people who served with me.